You want a billion-dollar game plan? Great. But first, is any of this actually legal? Let's break down the fine print.
Have you ever just looked at one of these giant tech companies and thought, how on earth did they get so big so fast? Well, it turns out there's a hidden playbook, a literal 7-step game plan for building a billion-dollar empire. And today, we're going to break that down. But here's the real twist. The same logic that built these incredible companies might actually be a hidden trap in your own financial plan.
And that, right there, brings us to the biggest question of this whole explainer. When you think about the ride-sharing app you use, or that buy now, pay later option you see everywhere, or even some of the ways you might be investing, was any of it actually legal? The answer, as you're about to see, is way more complicated and honestly a lot more interesting than a simple yes or no. So let's dig in.
All right, so here's how we're going to tackle this. First up, we're going to pull back the curtain on the corporate strategy itself. What is this billion-dollar loophole? And what is the 7-step playbook that tech companies use to exploit it? Then in part 2, we're going to turn the mirror around and ask, are we playing the same game in our own finances? What happens when the rules suddenly change? And what's the final choice? Do we exploit these gaps, or do we demand they get closed for good?
So let's get right to the heart of it. The core concept here is a strategy that lets companies get into markets that nobody else thought was even possible, all by operating in these weird, legal gray areas, right on the very edge of the law.
Okay, so the fancy term for this is regulatory arbitrage. And what's so key about this definition is that it's not about breaking the law. It's about finding and exploiting the gaps between the laws. The idea is actually pretty simple. If you can find a little gray area in how a regulation is written, you can offer something that's way faster, cheaper, or just more convenient than your competitors, who are all stuck playing by the rules as they were intended. And believe me, this isn't some obscure business school theory. It is the literal foundation of some of the biggest companies we use every single day. Uber just brilliantly danced around decades of taxi medallion laws. Airbnb basically ignored all the complex hotel zoning and licensing rules. And all those buy now, pay later services, they managed to frame themselves as something other than lenders to get around really strict consumer protection laws. You see the pattern here? In every single case, they found a legal gray area and just drove a billion-dollar truck right through it.
But you know what? This game is not new at all. The term regulatory arbitrage really blew up back in the 1980s with global banking. See, these things called the Basel Accords tried to make banks all hold the same amount of cash in reserve. But some countries said you only need to hold 5%, while others said 25%. So what do you think the banks did? Of course, they set up shop in the countries with the loosest rules. That let them lend out more money and make way more profit. Then, in the 2000s, they created these non-bank lenders that weren't technically part of the bank, so they could write more mortgages than they were legally allowed to. And yeah, we all know how that story ended. The big difference today is that technology has put this whole strategy on steroids.
So, the big question is, how exactly do they pull this off? Well, it's not by accident. It's a repeatable 7-step playbook for building an absolute empire in these gray areas. So let's break down the game plan step by step. Step 1, you find an industry that's totally broken and drowning in regulations. Think about sectors where rules have just piled up for decades, making everything slow and super expensive for regular people. Taxis were the perfect target. For our explainer, let's imagine a company called Schooly, and they decide to go after the education system. Now, step 2 is where it gets really clever. You create a legal defense by finding a similar non-commercial activity to use as your cover story. Right? This is what I like to call the "don't worry bro" defense. It's this flimsy, kind of ridiculous argument, but it's just enough to create that legal gray area you need. Uber's was, come on, these aren't unlicensed taxis, it's just carpooling. The buy now, pay later guys said, this isn't a loan, it's basically just online layaway. In our fake company Schooly, they'd say, this isn't an unregistered school with unqualified teachers. No, it's just a network for parents to share homeschooling duties. See? This defense doesn't have to hold up in court forever, it just has to work long enough for the next step.
And step 3 is the secret sauce. It's the ingredient that changes everything. You leverage technology. This is the thing that turns a really weak legal argument into a multi-billion-dollar business. It's the engine that lets you just flat out outrun the regulators.
Technology is the absolute key for 3 reasons. First, it lets you scale up incredibly fast. You're not building schools or buying taxis yourself, you're just building a digital network. This lets you grow way faster than any government agency can possibly react. Second, it's so much cheaper. You're just the middleman, right? You don't own the cars or the apartments. Other people take on those costs. And third, that massive scalability is exactly what venture capitalists are dying to invest in. They're chasing that 1000x return, and a tech platform offers that kind of potential in a way a traditional business never, ever could. Okay, so let's get to the expansion phase and see how this thing snowballs. Step 4. You launch carefully. You don't start in New York City. You pick a city or state with a friendly pro-tech government and really weak regulatory oversight. Step 5. You buy local support. This is where all that investor money comes in. You just burn through it to subsidize your service, making it ridiculously cheap for users. You overpay your gig workers, and you donate to local charities. Now, this isn't just about growing. It's about building up political cover for later. And then step 6, you repeat everywhere. You expand as fast as humanly possible, moving from the places with no rules to the ones with the most rules. And when a city tries to stop you, you just use your giant war chest of investor cash to drag them through the courts for years.
And all of this leads to the final and most important step: become too big to nail. By the time any real legal challenges make their way through the slow-moving court system, you already have millions of users and hundreds of thousands of contractors who depend on you. You're a major economic force in the city, and at that point, even if a court finally rules against you, it's pretty much too late. What politician is going to risk the backlash of shutting down a service that employs that many of their voters? You've basically made yourself a permanent part of the landscape.
So that's the corporate playbook. It's kind of fascinating and maybe a little bit scary. But you might be sitting there thinking, okay, cool story, but what does this have to do with me? Well, what if I told you that a lot of the most popular personal finance and investing strategies out there are basically just a scaled-down version of this exact same game?
Just look at these parallels. A company like Airbnb using regulatory arbitrage to get around hotel laws, well, that's not so different from an individual doing short-term rental arbitrage, right? Renting an apartment and then listing it on Airbnb for a profit, which is often in a legal gray area of their lease or city rules. And buy now, pay later services avoiding lending standards, that kind of has the same vibe as individuals who churn 0% APR credit cards to juggle debt. And that whole high-risk, high-growth VC model, we see its reflection in retail investors using super high-leverage margin loans on apps like Robinhood. The truth is, a lot of us, especially in the FIRE community, have been using these little loopholes to get ahead.
And you know what? For a while, it totally worked. But here's the fundamental problem with any strategy that's built on top of a loophole. The clock is always ticking. Sooner or later, the regulators catch up, the politicians decide to close the gap, and the rules of the game change. And when that happens, the people who depended on that loophole are the ones who get caught.
And this really gets to the core of the problem. Just because a strategy was technically legal yesterday doesn't mean it was fair, and it absolutely does not mean it was sustainable. So many financial plans were built on the assumption that these gray areas would just last forever, but they won't. And this is the central idea behind what some people are now calling the 2026 wealth trap.
And this isn't some far-off hypothetical problem. It's happening right now. We are already seeing these loopholes slam shut. The IRS and FINRA are starting to crack down hard on what they call abusive margin practices. In just the last couple of years, over 40 cities have passed new laws that either restrict or totally ban short-term rentals, crushing the STR arbitrage model. And banks, they're getting way smarter about spotting and shutting down accounts that consistently churn those 0% APR offers. The game is changing as we speak. Now, think about the impact this could have on your own financial goals. I mean, it could be huge. Imagine you were counting on a short-term rental for, say, 40% of your passive income on your path to financial independence. If that gets shut down overnight, you're not just losing income, you are losing years of your life. Or if you get a margin call on a portfolio that was leveraged to the hilt, that setback could be absolutely devastating. For some people, the closing of these loopholes could delay their retirement plans by 3, 5, even 7 years.
So this all leads us to a really fundamental dilemma, not just for our economy, but for our own financial lives. When we're faced with these gaps in the system, what's the right thing to do?
What's so interesting here is that there are really two sides to this coin. On one side, you've got regulatory arbitrage, where new companies use loopholes to shake up an old, stuffy industry. And yeah, that can lead to innovation and some real short-term benefits for us as consumers. But on the other side, you have its evil twin, regulatory capture. That's when the old big companies actually create all the red tape and regulations specifically to block any new competitors from even entering the market. Think of taxi companies lobbying for medallion laws. Sometimes a little bit of arbitrage is the only thing that can break up a cozy, anti-competitive monopoly.
So, if the game is kind of rigged no matter what, how do you build a personal financial plan that nobody can shut down?
Well, you make it bulletproof. Instead of building your future on loopholes, you build it on solid ground. You can incorporate your side hustles into an LLC for real legal protection, you deleverage, and you stop relying so much on margin loans. You focus on what I like to call boring but bulletproof income, things like long-term rentals and dividend stocks, and you plan for the worst, recalculating your goals, assuming things will get tougher, not easier. The goal isn't to exploit the system, it's to build a system of your own that no one can ever take away from you.
And all of that leaves us with one final and pretty challenging question. Knowing everything we've just gone through, the corporate playbook, the risks to our own finances, and the two-sided nature of all this regulation, what should our approach be? Should we as individuals and as a society just try to exploit whatever gaps are left while we still can? Or should we push for a fairer, more stable system by demanding that all of these loopholes get closed once and for all? There's definitely no easy answer, but it's a question worth thinking about.